Born dirt poor on Staten Island in 1794, Cornelius Vanderbilt had exactly one asset as a young man: an absolute refusal to lose. At 16, he borrowed $100 from his mother, bought a small ferryboat, and began shuttling passengers and cargo across New York Harbor. By the time he was 18, he was running multiple boats and outcompeting every rival on the water. It was the beginning of one of the most extraordinary accumulations of wealth and power in American history, and remarkably, the railroad wasn't even part of the plan. Not yet. For the first half of his life, Vanderbilt was a steamboat man. He worked under the entrepreneur Thomas Gibbons in the 1810s, running ferry routes along the Hudson River and the New Jersey coast. When Gibbons clashed with the state-sanctioned steamboat monopoly held by Robert Livingston and Robert Fulton, a monopoly that controlled all steam navigation in New York waters, it was Vanderbilt who personally captained the boats, outrunning state agents sent to shut him down, hiding passengers below deck, and daring authorities to stop him. The legal battle that followed went all the way to the Supreme Court. Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824 broke the monopoly wide open, establishing that the federal government controlled interstate commerce. Vanderbilt didn't win that case, Gibbons did, but Vanderbilt understood its implications better than almost anyone. Open competition was coming, and open competition was exactly where he thrived. Through the 1830s and 1840s, Vanderbilt built his own steamboat empire, slashing fares to drive competitors out of business, then raising them once the competition was gone. He was ruthless, calculating, and extraordinarily effective. Rivals paid him simply to stay off certain routes, essentially bribing him not to compete. He took the money, stayed off the routes for a while, then returned anyway. By the time the California gold rush hit in 1848, Vanderbilt had found yet another opportunity. While everyone else was routing passengers to California via Panama, Vanderbilt opened a faster, cheaper route through Nicaragua, undercutting his competitors and pocketing the difference. By the mid-1850s, he was worth around $11 million, an almost incomprehensible sum at the time, and was known simply as the Commodore. Then, in his late 60s, when most men of his era were winding down, Vanderbilt made the most consequential pivot of his career. He turned his attention to railroads. The timing was not accidental. By the 1860s, railroads had become the arteries of the American economy. They moved goods, people, and capital at speeds that steamboats simply couldn't match on land. But the railroad industry in the northeastern United States was a mess, fragmented, poorly managed, riddled with corruption, and desperately in need of the kind of ruthless operational discipline that Vanderbilt had been perfecting his entire life. His entry point was the New York and Harlem Railroad, a modest line running through Manhattan. In 1862, Vanderbilt began buying shares aggressively. He was 68 years old. Rather than simply investing passively and collecting dividends like a typical stockholder of the era, Vanderbilt moved directly onto the board of directors, took operational control, and began rebuilding the railroad from the ground up. He replaced incompetent management, upgraded the rolling stock, improved scheduling, and cut unnecessary costs. The share price responded accordingly, climbing sharply as the market recognized that the Commodore's touch was turning a struggling railroad into a functioning one. This is the moment that defines Vanderbilt's place in financial history. What he was doing had no real name yet, but what he was doing was activist investing, buying a significant stake in an undervalued or mismanaged company, taking an active role in its governance, and forcing operational changes that unlocked the underlying value. A strategy that would become standard practice on Wall Street more than a century later. Vanderbilt was doing it in 1862, but the Harlem Railroad was just the opening move. Vanderbilt's ambitions were far larger. He understood something that most of his contemporaries hadn't fully grasped: that a single short railroad line was worth far less than a connected network. The real value lay in consolidation, in building an unbroken chain of track that could move freight and passengers from one major city to another without the costly, time-consuming transfers between competing lines. His next acquisition was the Hudson River Railroad in 1864, which ran parallel to the river connecting New York City to Albany. Then came the most important move of all, the New York Central Railroad in 1867. The New York Central was a far larger and more prestigious line than either of his previous acquisitions, running from Albany westward to Buffalo along what would become one of the most commercially vital corridors in the country. Getting control of it required a bold and characteristically aggressive maneuver. When the New York Central's directors refused to negotiate with him on terms he considered reasonable, Vanderbilt simply stopped allowing New York Central trains to connect with his Hudson River Railroad at the Albany terminal in the middle of winter. Passengers were stranded. Freight piled up. The disruption was immediate and severe. The New York Central's board came to the table within weeks. Vanderbilt got his railroad. He merged the New York Central with the Hudson River Railroad in 1869, creating the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad, a continuous line running from New York City all the way to Buffalo. It was, at the time, one of the longest and most operationally sophisticated railroads in the world. Vanderbilt immediately set about improving it the same way he had improved every enterprise he'd ever touched. Better equipment, tighter scheduling, reduced operating costs, and a relentless focus on volume over margin. Move more freight, move it faster, move it cheaper. The profits followed. His ambitions didn't stop at Buffalo. Vanderbilt recognized that Buffalo was not the destination. Chicago was. The great Midwestern city was rapidly becoming the commercial hub of the entire continent, and whoever controlled reliable rail access between New York and Chicago controlled a significant portion of American commerce itself. Through a combination of stock purchases, lease agreements, and outright acquisitions, Vanderbilt extended his reach westward, eventually securing effective control over the Lake Shore and Michigan Southern Railway, which completed the connection to Chicago. For the first time in history, a single railroad system could carry freight and passengers in unbroken service from New York City to Chicago, nearly 900 miles of coordinated rail operations under unified management. The Grand Central Depot, which Vanderbilt constructed on 42nd Street in Manhattan and opened in 1871, was the physical embodiment of this vision. Built at enormous personal expense, Vanderbilt funded much of it himself. It consolidated 3 separate rail terminals into one magnificent facility, the largest railroad station in the United States at the time. It was not merely a building. It was a statement. This is what a railroad empire looks like when one man decides to build it properly. Along the way, Vanderbilt was not without his failures and controversies. His attempt to acquire the Erie Railroad in 1868 turned into one of the most spectacular corporate battles of the 19th century. His opponents, the Erie's directors, including the notorious J. Gould and James Fisk, responded to Vanderbilt's stock purchases by simply printing new shares, flooding the market and diluting his position. Vanderbilt lost millions. The episode, which became known as the Erie War, revealed that even the Commodore had limits, and that the era of the robber barons was not simply about building things but about who was willing to fight dirtiest. Vanderbilt, for all his ferocity, drew a line at outright fraud. Gould and Fisk did not. He never captured the Erie. By the time Vanderbilt died in January 1877, at the age of 82, he was worth an estimated $100 million, making him the wealthiest man in the United States and one of the wealthiest individuals in the world. He left the vast majority of his fortune to his son William Henry Vanderbilt, who doubled it within 8 years, a testament to the strength of the railroad infrastructure his father had built. The empire Vanderbilt constructed didn't just make him rich. It physically connected the American economy in ways that accelerated industrialization, enabled mass commerce, and set the template for what a modern, professionally managed corporation could look like. He demonstrated that railroads were not just civil engineering projects, they were businesses, and businesses could be run well or badly, and the difference between the two was management, discipline, and will. More than a century and a half later, the financial strategy he pioneered in his late 60s, buy in, take control, fix what's broken, and capture the value, remains one of the most powerful and controversial tools in the investor's arsenal. Activist investing has 1,000 modern practitioners, but it has only one original, and he ran ferry boats before he ever touched a railroad. His empire was not built on abstract financial instruments or speculative bubbles. It was built on steel rails, timetables, and the relentless elimination of inefficiency. Every mile of track he controlled reduced friction in the system. Every consolidation removed a point of failure, and every operational improvement compounded across the network, turning incremental gains into massive system-wide advantages. This is what made his fortune durable. It wasn't just large, it was structurally embedded in the functioning of the economy itself. Even after his death, the systems he had put in place continued to generate value, continued to move freight, continued to define the flow of American commerce. The empire Vanderbilt constructed didn't just make him rich. It physically connected the American economy in ways that accelerated industrialization, enabled mass commerce, and set the template for what a modern, professionally managed corporation could look like. He demonstrated that railroads were not just civil engineering projects, they were businesses, and businesses could be run well or badly, and the difference between the two was management, discipline, and will. And in an era before formal business schools, before standardized management theory, Vanderbilt was effectively writing the playbook in real time, through trial, error, and an almost instinctive understanding of leverage, incentives, and scale. More than a century and a half later, the financial strategy he pioneered in his late 60s, buy in, take control, fix what's broken, and capture the value, remains one of the most powerful and controversial tools in the investor's arsenal. Activist investing has 1,000 modern practitioners, but it has only one original. And while the tactics have evolved, proxy fights, public campaigns, complex financial engineering, the underlying logic remains almost identical to what Vanderbilt practiced in the 1860s. Find inefficiency, apply pressure, force change, realize value. And perhaps the most remarkable part of Vanderbilt's story is not just that he built one of the greatest fortunes in history, it's when he did it. Not in youth, not in the early rise of his career, but in his late 60s and 70s, at an age when most of his contemporaries had already stepped aside. The railroad empire, the achievement that would define his legacy, was in many ways a second act. A reinvention built on decades of experience, sharpened instincts, and a lifetime of competition. It is easy, in hindsight, to see the inevitability of his success.